Thank you so much for the invitation. And I wanted to say also, please feel free to interrupt if you have any questions or ask in the chat. I want this to be, informal. And then there'll be questions at the end, right, too, as well, right? Yeah, feel free to jump in anytime. So yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. And today I want to talk about GANs in particular, generative adversarial networks, and as they apply to population genetics. And I also wanted to give a little bit of history of sort of machine learning in the field, so that if you're not quite familiar, that you have a chance to kind of see these topics. So like many population geneticists, I'm really interested in this sort of fundamental question of how do we go from all of this data that we have, all the sequencing data, to make inferences about evolution or something that happened in the past. And maybe one question we could think about is, if we have sort of haplotype data and it's aligned and we have called the SNPs, how could we learn, say, recombination or recombination hotspots? But as a computer scientist, I'm also really interested in, okay, if we change the data or change the species or change the question we are interested in, what kind of methods would really transfer to a variety of contexts? So here's, maybe we're interested in mutation or natural selection. How could we develop a method that would really translate to these various questions in various species? So maybe we would want that to be a machine learning method. We definitely want it to be fast and flexible. And I think machine learning has shown to really be able to pick up these sort of subtle signals from noisy data. And so that's why I was interested in developing this type of method. So today I wanted to give kind of some context for when this shift in the field happened toward machine learning, and then also sort of a second shift toward using more raw data and moving away from summary statistics. But mainly I'll talk about our algorithm, PGGAN, which is a GAN method for creating realistic data. Okay, so I want to just highlight one early method, this is 2013, that used machine learning to detect, in this case, selection. So they were really interested in identifying regions that were neutral versus positively selected, and they use the site frequency spectrum to do this. And if you're not familiar with a site frequency spectrum, we can at least see that this summary statistic is different, say between this blue line versus say the red line for neutral versus selection. So you can train a machine learning method to sort of pick up on this difference and hopefully be able to identify regions under selection. And the idea is that if you simulate a lot of data where sometimes the regions under selection and sometimes they're neutral regions, you can fit this model, in this case a support vector machine, to detect the difference between these data sets in the summary statistic space. So maybe these are two of the dimensions, number of singletons and say doubletons. And then after you do this training procedure and then you see a new data set coming in, say this region of real data, then you can say, okay, well, it's probably neutral because it's on the side that's for the neutral regions. So this is kind of basic idea, is that you're training and you're fitting the model, and then you can test it with real data. So the issue there is, we have all these summary statistics, which ones are you going to use? And so during my PhD, I was really interested in developing a method that would just take in any summary statistic we could think of, and it doesn't really matter what all these are, but I sort of combed the literature and came up with, hundreds of summary statistics that could be used. And what kind of method would be really appropriate for these, which have a lot of correlations, a lot of redundancy. So I was really interested in developing this deep learning method that would actually distill down all this information in the summary statistics, and perform some sort of inference. And so this is what I did, and I was inspired by images, sort of this neural network style method that would actually distill down information in the pixels into sort of these more and more sophisticated features that would actually be able to tell us something about our parameters of inference, parameters of interest. So that's what I did, and I developed this method for Drosophila that would actually take in all of these summary statistics and then infer something about the population sizes in the form of this simple bottleneck, and then also natural selection. But this was kind of early times for deep learning in population genetics, and the the real issue, I think, with this is that we had to compute all these summary statistics, and which is A, computationally expensive, and B, we might need to change them for a different application, or have too much. It requires too much expertise, this type of summary statistics. So this kind of prompted the second shift, I would say, toward more raw data and away from summary statistics. And primarily, people were really thinking about using convolutional neural networks for this, or CNNs. And the kind of idea here is that we can learn these filters that will actually pick up on informative parts of our data. And so maybe for images, we would say develop a feather feature or a beak feature that would then, tell us that this is a bird. And then there would be a high probability at the end that this would be classified as a bird. The issue with sort of translating these methods directly toward genetic data is that we don't really know, what types of filters we might need for genetic data. They would be different than images. And then also the order of the rows for us, which are, we kind of think about haplotypes on the rows of this matrix. We wouldn't want to assume that there is an ordering there if they're all from the same population. So these issues need to sort of be overcome if we're actually going to be able to apply this to a different data set. So this is a work that from around 2018, where we developed the CNN for this raw population genetic data. And we can think about the individuals on the rows, and this SNPs or sites of variation on the columns. And then we want to feed this through some sort of neural network and infer some parameter of interest. So this could be recombination. So kind of think about this as whatever your favorite parameter is, mutation, selection, something like that. And the architecture of this method is really meant to be permutation invariant, in the sense that the order of these samples shouldn't matter. And so instead of using square filters, which is more common in image CNNs, we use these single dimension filters and distill down the information that way, until eventually we get to this permutation invariant function that collapses all the information across the haplotypes. This can be sum or max or average or something like that, and then a few fully connected layers. And then we infer our parameter of interest. So this was sort of a general architecture that can be used for a lot of different problems. And we call this method Definetti. However, we still have this issue that to train this type of neural network method, we'd have to simulate the data, because otherwise we don't know what the ground truth is, or the parameter of interest that we want to infer. And so this kind of led me to really wanting to develop a GAN algorithm, or generative adversarial network algorithm, that would really be designed for creating realistic training data for these machine learning methods. Because if our training data is not similar to our real data that we're trying to test, we really can't be that confident about our inferences. So to motivate this a little bit more, so probably many of you have used simulations in your in your work. Maybe SLIM, MS Prime are very popular simulators, and it's difficult to overstate, how important simulation is for population genetics. They help us validate methods, compare methods. For machine learning methods, they help with training the method, and really any method we want to sort of understand how it works better, we need to probably use simulations to test it out. But it can be very difficult to really match the data to match the simulated data to the real data. And I wanted to just show a few examples of this. In the middle here is identity by descent length distribution for an Amish population. So there's a lot of IBD sharing. And then we tried our best to kind of simulate this in various situations, and we couldn't really get the same distribution. And similarly, for this 1,000 genomes population, this is an African population, we were not able, with sort of default parameters in standard PopSim, actually, we are not able to get a very close match between the numbers of SNPs per region for the real and simulated data. Yeah, any questions so far?
Yeah, I have one. So what is the, why do we use the simulated data then? Why don't we use part of the real data?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that would be ideal. But typically we don't know what the ground truth is for the real data. And this kind of comes back to there's only really, one experiment in evolution. And so we really want simulated data because we know what, say, if we want to infer mutation rate, we simulate lots of data sets where we know the mutation rate, and then we see, maybe what's similar to the real data, and we say, okay, then we know what the mutation rate is for the real data. But it would be much more ideal to use that. There are a few situations where we can sort of do experimental evolution, and then we know what the ground truth is. But they tend to be in, say, yeast or maybe even Drosophila, situations where there's a very fast reproduction, and we can know what the underlying evolutionary parameters are. But you're totally right. I mean, it would be much more ideal to use the real data directly, but there's some cases, I would say, unfortunately, most cases where we can't really do that.
Okay, thank you. Crystal clear.
Yeah.
I have a question also. Like, could it be also because we're super used to work with European populations that like the dynamics are different to the African ones, and African ones I would expect to be more complicated dynamics?
Right. I mean, I think that's a huge issue with simulation in general. And I think that we often sort of plug in what we think of as, European parameters for other populations, and it's not appropriate. I think with this specific case, actually, this is an African demography, but the mutation rate was sort of different for there's a sort of mismatch between the mutation rate and the demographic history there. And so I think that was part of the issue with this particular simulation. But I more wanted to highlight that if you kind of do something kind of quickly and pull some parameters from another population, it tends not to work. But I think part of my motivation for developing a GAN method was for populations that are less well studied. And especially when you move to different species, then there are lots of populations where you're just kind of guessing from a similar species what the default mutation rate is. And can we move away from that? I think that's kind of the goal of this sort of GAN method. Yeah, anything else? So yeah, how are we going to do this? So how do we actually maybe bake in the process of developing good simulations to our into a machine learning algorithm? And so I was really inspired by GANs, this Generative Adversarial Network. And the kind of idea of how this works is, say you're trying to get into the art forgery business, and maybe your first efforts are not so great, and it's pretty obvious that this is not real. So maybe you go back and you learn more about artwork, and you say, okay, well, I'll try again. I'll try a bit. I'll try a bit harder. And so, yeah, I don't know, any guesses for which one is real and which one is fake in this case? Or which one is the fake one?
The right one is a fake one.
I actually thought it was the other way around, but...
It's because you can see the signature.
Oh, yeah, this one is the fake. Yes, this one is the fake one, yeah. This one is not the real Picasso, but it's closer, right, maybe than before. So maybe you go back and you say, okay, I'll learn a little bit more about artwork, and I'll do a bit better. And then maybe you try this, and I don't know what this looks like to you, but these are actually both hypothesized to be fake Jackson Pollocks. But I think the core idea here is this progression, or you should get better over time. And that's kind of the idea with the training of these GAN methods, is that first you start out and these guesses are not very realistic. They're not very close to the real data, but over time you can train them to become better. And where this adversarial process comes in is these two entities that you have this sort of the art forger and the art critic. And they both start out not very sophisticated. So in the beginning, you don't need to be a famous art critic to know that there's sort of differences between these real and fake data. But as time goes on, and then the forger gets better, you need to sort of pick up on more subtle points in the data. And so these are trained in concert, and so they usually alternate the training between them over time, and so they both get better. And for, say, images, for example, this generator and the discriminator, which is the sort of art critic, they're typically both CNNs, or this convolutional neural network method. And one note is that unlike for a lot of machine learning algorithms where you want a really high accuracy, your actual goal is more that the discriminator has sort of a 50% accuracy, in that it's completely confused between the real and the fake. So if it had sort of perfect accuracy, that would suggest that there's a lot of differences between them. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're looking at GANs, is that you really want there to be sort of this rather low accuracy. So for us, what we developed with what we call PGGAN is we still have this notion of a discriminator that will distinguish between the generated data and the real data. And the kind of form of the data is similar to this idea before, is that we have the individuals or haplotypes on the rows, and then we have the SNPs or sites of variation on the columns. And this is ultimately a binary classifier, this discriminator, and it's just, is it fake or is it real? Where things get a little bit different than, say, a traditional image GAN is that the generator in this case is actually based on an evolutionary process. And so here we could use an evolutionary simulator, say MS Prime or SLIM, and then that generator is actually trying to pick the parameters that we choose for the simulation. So say we had some sort of split with, migration, and we had these 3 population sizes that we wanted to infer, then those would be the things that the generator is actually trying to optimize over. So in terms of the training, we have to alternate and still are sort of updating the model between the generator and the discriminator. So how do we actually train the generator? Because this is not a differentiable function, we can't really use any sort of gradient-based approach. And so we actually use a simulated annealing training algorithm. And the idea behind this is that we start out with guesses for, say, in this case, N1, N2, N3, these population sizes. And then we kind of jump around from that initial guess, slowly decreasing this temperature that will lead us to then take smaller and smaller steps until we finally reach the parameters of interest. So in this way, this is kind of a classic sort of non-gradient method. For us, we change one parameter at a time, as we found that was sort of best for the training process. In terms of the models, we have a variety of models that we incorporated into the generator. And we have various one population models, say just a really simple constant population size, and then sort of more realistic sort of exponential growth model. We have a variety of 2 population models, isolation with migration, and some that represent sort of out of Africa event, and then post out of Africa splits. And then finally, also, this is from the Gudenkunst Daddy paper. This is a more complex 3 population model for representing sort of human evolution. And you can define your own models for PGGAN, but right now, at least, you do need to specify an evolutionary model that you're trying to learn. Although I'll talk a little bit later about sort of model selection. In terms of the discriminator training, we do use a CNN for the discriminator, but we use the CNN that's based on Di-Finetti, which is that exchangeable, or sort of, it doesn't assume the order of the haplotypes here. And so to say a little bit more about the discriminator, so we still have, say for a one population model, we still have the samples or haplotypes on the rows and the SNPs on the columns, and we still do this sort of one-dimensional filters across this to make sure that these maintain the permutation and variance. The difference here is that instead of this evolutionary parameter, which we did before, that was our output of the CNN, we output instead this probability of real. So to make this a discriminator, we want this to be a binary classification problem, and we output this probability of real here. So I think that's kind of important for how we're kind of modifying the architecture to make it a discriminator. And we also extend this to multiple populations. So for two populations, for two populations, we would have the permutation and variance within each population, but then separate filters between the populations. And so this allows us to kind of maintain permutation and variance within each population. And we can even extend this to 3 populations, or it's sort of unlimited, but we have more and more parameters to learn once we extend to multiple populations. Okay, and to say that I have one slide of math, which I think is kind of important to kind of think about when we're thinking about what the loss functions are for GANs and how this is trained. So we usually denote Z are the regions of simulated data, and X are the regions of real data. And we're kind of, this is really a minimax sort of dual optimization problem when we're thinking about GANs. And so we have different loss functions for the discriminator and the generator. So the generator loss is only based on the sort of fake data. And this D is a probability that it's real. So what we're saying when we think about this loss function is that we want this fake data, we want to predict that fake data is real. So we're incentivizing the generator to say, okay, all the fake data is real. And then what we're doing for the discriminator is sort of the opposite, in that we want the discriminator to say the correct thing. We really want the discriminator to say, okay, we predict the real data is real and the fake data is fake. And so that's why this 1 minus D. So we want the 1 minus the probability that it's real. We want it to be predicted as fake. And this kind of, I think, kind of sort of helps clarify what's going on in the adversarial nature of GANs. It really comes down to the loss function. So we want these two terms here are really at odds with each other. We want the discriminator to predict this data as the fake data is fake, and then the generator to predict the fake data as real. Yeah, any questions so far before I talk about kind of the training and validation part?
I have one question.
Yeah.
In the discriminator, you said before that we're aiming for 50% accuracy, but sometimes like 50% accuracy could be everything is one class. Like how do we know what it's doing?
Yes, yeah, that's an excellent point. And actually, I have a slide on that. So that is, you're completely right. We do want 50% accuracy, but it's really 50% for each class, because something that can happen is it degenerates, the training degenerates, and that it predicts everything is real, or everything is fake, and then it gets 50% accuracy that way. And so what we ended up doing is just graphing the loss over time, and also the accuracy over time, and detecting that. But I think it's a really, GAN training is sort of notoriously delicate, and it can just kind of go off the rails pretty quickly because maybe the discriminator learns faster than the generator or vice versa. So we actually have some ideas I'll talk about at the end about how to fix that, but it's something that does happen for sure. And that's a great point.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, okay, so training pitfalls, that's exactly what happens. So one kind of compounding issue with GANs is that it's very difficult to actually evaluate them. And for images, you could show people pictures of, say, faces and ask them whether they think they're sort of real or fake. And actually, you can see that since 2014 to 2018, these are all fake people. Things got a lot better. I mean, this person could definitely be a real person. So you can do user studies and things like that to try to get at this notion of are you being actually realistic? But there's a few issues with that. Maybe you just spit out the images that you're trained on, right? And so someone thinks they're realistic, but they're actually just because they didn't see the originals. So that can be an issue. And this is also kind of very time consuming and expensive to do these type of user studies. You can also feed them into some sort of pre-existing, really, really excellent GAN and see if they are classified as real or fake, but it's very difficult to evaluate GANs. We developed a few different metrics, and one of them was making sure that we don't go to this degenerate state of classifying everything as real or fake. We did use summary statistics as kind of a general comparison. So if we're not matching on summary statistics, we know that we're not really matching on anything else, right? If we can't match on like number of SNPs per region in our real and fake, that's kind of a sign that it's not very good. And then we also looked at discriminator accuracy, and we also did some cases where the training data is actually simulated as well, so we know the ground truth, and so that can also help us identify whether we're actually creating realistic data. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these, a few of these metrics today. So this is this example of sort of failed GAN training. So to kind of go through this type of picture. This is the loss over the number of iterations, this first panel, and the generator and discriminator loss. And then the accuracy for the fake and real data is here. So basically what's happening here is that the discriminator classifies everything as real. And so it's 100% accurate on the real data, but 0% accurate on the fake data. And then basically what kind of happens here is that the discriminator is saying, oh, everything is real. So whatever fake Picasso you come up with, no matter how bad it is, it says, oh, that's real, that belongs in the Louvre, right? And so you're kind of saying here that there's no way for the generator or like the art forger to actually get better. Like there's no feedback for their learning. And so what happens is that sometimes you just take a random walk around the parameter space because everything is classified as real. And so this type of, if we ever see degenerate training, we throw out that run. Here's an example where this is sort of a successful training. So at the beginning, the discriminator is easily able to sort of tell the difference. And this is sort of represented by the discriminator loss actually being very low at the beginning. So discriminator is very good, and the generator loss is actually very high. So it's poor at the beginning. And then over time, we get this situation where, more or less, we're kind of converging in both the fake accuracy and real accuracy are around 50%, which is the goal. And then typically, if your GAN training is successful, the generator and discriminator losses should be pretty balanced. So you really that's where this kind of like arms race comes in. You don't want one to be sort of dominating the other. And then we can see this in an additional way is that this is an example where the GAN training failed and we moved to a degenerate state. And then these really represent a bunch of different summary statistics here. It's not super important what all these are, but you may be familiar with some of them. But basically, there's not a good match between, say, Tajima's D for the simulated and the real data because the training has failed. And so this gives us a notion of, that there's some feedback, that we're able to get from these summary statistics in the sense that it can tell us when things are sort of working or not. So it's not a terrible evaluation metric, but with summary statistics, I always think, there could be loss of information. And so it's not to say that there's other summary statistics that, could capture this data better. In contrast, say we have an example where the GAN training was successful. And then in this case, the simulated and the real have a very close match in this case. So this is what we're sort of looking for. We really want, this is an indication of successful training. It's not necessarily the end all be all, but that this tells us that our training has been pretty successful in creating realistic data. So yeah, this kind of shows our ways of evaluation of GANs, and then I want to talk about some results on human data. So yeah, any questions so far on the kind of methods part?
I have a naive question. Just to check the GANs are working, you need like real data, right? You train with real data and then you check with real data, I guess, that you have not used for training.
Well, for the, that's a great question. So in some sense, we actually don't really need a test data set because we're not really doing anything afterward. We're sort of just saying, okay, now we've fit these parameters. So we typically use the entire real data set as part of the training process. But we definitely could use use a held aside test data set if we wanted to assess what the discriminator was doing afterward. But because we do the inference process sort of as part of our training, we don't typically have a held aside test data set. I guess one other note as well is that when we do some of our testing, we actually used a simulated data set as the real data, and so that we would know if we were actually matching parameters. So that's another way of kind of getting at, are you actually learning the parameters correctly? You can use a sort of simulation, your simulated data as sort of a fake data.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question about, can we actually, if you learn, say, this GAN algorithm on one population, does it apply to a slightly different one or a slightly different data set? I think that's something that's open right now. So we tested on 1,000 genomes data, and but this could really apply for lots of different data sets. So one metric that we wanted to test out at first is this discriminator accuracy. And so you can kind of think about this as the GAN confusion. This is the thing we want to be close to 50%, but we also kind of ignore runs that are degenerate or classify all the data as real. And so our goal line is this sort of dotted line here of this 50%. One sort of interesting result is that when we look at a single population model, say this constant population, we typically were sort of less confused than if we used a more realistic model with exponential growth. So yeah, the kind of takeaway here is that if we use a more realistic model, we get more confusion, meaning that the discriminator is more confused with the real versus the fake data, which is what we want. So we're happy to sort of see this overall, that these were closer to 50%. For two population models, we were also getting pretty close to that 50%. It's not exact, and I think that's to say that we cannot model. We probably can never totally model all the things of the real data, especially with data quality issues and so on. So I think that's something that is good to keep in mind. What are the unmodeled factors that we're not accounting for? And so to say a little bit more about the summary statistics, if we then say we zoom in on this situation where we're looking at the single population models. This is for CHB, which is an East Asian population. If we look at, say, just trying to fit a constant population size, right? So this is just a one parameter model. Then our fit of the summary statistics is okay, but it's not perfect. But if we're able to fit a more realistic model with exponential growth and size changes, then we're able to really get a good fit with a lot of these summary statistics. And so this is kind of the goal, is that we're able to really generate data that's very realistic. We also tried this for a YRI CEU population split. So this sort of representing an out of Africa event, and we're able to get a good fit with the real data. And then one additional summary statistic that we used here was Hudson's FST between these populations, which also was very good with the real versus simulated. And then in terms of the actual parameters that we inferred for this model, this is pretty in line, I would say, with other results, is that we have sort of a large population size within Africa. This is the out of Africa bottleneck in CEU, and then an expansion in sort of the more recent past. We also infer this sort of back migration back into Africa, which has also been found in some other in some other studies as well. In terms of the 3 population model, this is with YRI, CEU, and CHB. We get a pretty good fit for many summary statistics. We do see that in CEU, Tajima's D is a little bit off, and we think that's probably because of unmodeled selection or potentially unmodeled archaic admixture. So I think it's also kind of interesting to see what is not in our models and how that kind of manifests itself in our results. In terms of the parameter inference here, we also get numbers that they're pretty in line with the literature in terms of ancestral sizes and exponential growth parameters as well. So yeah, just to say a little bit about where I think this is going. So for us thinking about PGGAN, we have a few main research directions. So recently we've been thinking about applying PGGAN to mosquito populations, and this we would really need to kind of think about the data quality here, because it wouldn't be the same quality as humans, and there's also a lot of migration between mosquito populations, and the goal here would be really to kind of think about insecticide resistance and how that's been evolving. To say a little bit more about how do we get rid of this just degenerate training? So this is really an issue of sort of balancing the discriminator and generator training and not letting one get sort of too good too quickly and sort of outpace the other. And for that, we're working on some Wasserstein GAN methods, and these really allow for sort of more balance in the discriminator than generator. And finally, we're really thinking about how to use GANs for learning natural selection as well, because we realize that this is probably something that's kind of messing up things like Tajima's D and other summary statistics, is that we're not looking at natural selection right now. And I think, in general, a few different things that I would sort of suggest for future work. I think machine learning methods need to be more interpretable overall. We don't really know what features the discriminator is learning with this CNN. How can we interpret these filters that are being learned? And we also, I think, need to do a better job of sort of combining what we know about evolutionary inference, or what we know about actual evolution, the process of evolution, with machine learning. So I think sometimes what happens is that in machine learning, we sometimes throw away our knowledge of evolution in favor of these more sort of black box methods. And so I think that we could do a better job of sort of combining these two. And with that, I wanted to thank my lab and a lot of my collaborators over the years, and funding sources. And thank you for your attention. And yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions now.